Have you ever wondered how far someone can go if they would just stop overthinking? Now imagine that person is also really smart and super brave. Powerful mix, right? That's exactly who Frank Abagnale was. In just 5 years, he became a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and even a college teacher. Not because he studied or worked hard, but because he believed he could. That belief, mixed with the brains and boldness, led him to become one of the most famous con artists in the world. This is what was really going on in the mind of Frank Abagnale. Before we talk about what Frank Abagnale did, we need to understand how he managed to do it. We've looked closely at his story, and in our opinion, it all comes down to 3 key traits: intelligence, immaturity, and a deep distrust for structure and rules. These 3 things shaped how Frank saw the world, and they explained almost everything he did. Let's start with a distrust for structure and rules because it showed up early in his life. Frank Abagnale was in the 10th grade when his life suddenly changed. He was called out of class and taken to court without any explanation. He thought it was something small, but when he walked in and saw both of his parents sitting there, he found out they were getting a divorce. His parents had kept it a secret for years. They acted like everything at home was normal. It was too much to process because one day, his parents were together and now he was just sitting in front of a judge being asked a question no 16-year-old should have to answer. Who would you want to live with? Despite everything, Frank loved both his parents deeply, but the bond with his father was really strong, so he chose his father. Not long after the divorce, Frank watched his father's life fall apart. The business failed, the money ran out, the confidence disappeared. His dad went from being a respected man in the community to working a low-paying job at a post office. At the same time, Frank was still trying to make sense of the divorce. That's when something started to shift in his mind. Frank began to lose trust in rules, in systems, and in the idea that doing things the right way would keep your life together. A few months later, Frank made a choice. He packed a bag and got on a train to New York. He never saw or spoke to his parents after that. Frank was now in New York City. He was 16, alone, and had just $200 to his name. He quickly realized that being on your own wasn't as exciting as it sounded. Most jobs, for someone his age, paid next to nothing, barely enough for food, let alone rent. He did have a checking account back home, which gave him access to some money for a while. He started writing small checks to pull cash from that account, but eventually the money ran out. That's when he started writing checks that had no money behind them. The checks kept bouncing, and Frank began thinking of ways to get money from an empty account without getting suspected. This is where another trait shows up: intelligence. One day, while standing by in a hotel lobby, Frank noticed a group of pilots and flight attendants walking out. They looked powerful, respected, and confident. He realized that being a pilot was the perfect way to cash checks without raising suspicion, but he needed to look the part, so he called the airport pretending to be a Pan Am pilot who had lost his uniform at the dry cleaners. The airline told him to go to a local tailor they worked with and they would give him a replacement, and it worked. But getting the uniform was just the beginning. To actually walk onto a plane, he needed a pilot ID. So Frank came up with another plan. He posed as a college student writing a paper on airline careers and started interviewing real pilots and Pan Am executives. He listened closely, picked up their language, and learned to use the right words. Then, he visited an ID printing shop and told them he needed a sample ID for his article. He acted like he was just using himself as the model on the card. The ID still wasn't perfect, it needed a logo. So he found a Pan Am logo on a model airplane, peeled it off, and stuck it onto the badge. It looked real enough. With that, Frank could now walk through terminals like he belonged. You see, in previous terminals, people didn't really check the IDs. As long as it looked similar to an ID card, they were fine with it. Besides, he was 6 feet and 170 pounds by then, so even though he was just 16 years old, he looked and spoke the part. Eventually, he got arrested in Miami under suspicion of identity theft, but even then, he slipped away. He told police his name was Frank Williams and he showed them a real-looking pilot ID. He even called the flight crew he had befriended and they'd back him up, thinking he was just another co-pilot. Soon after that, Frank moved to a quiet residential area in Atlanta, Georgia, where he would meet a doctor who lived in the same apartment complex. Frank told him he was a pediatrician who had recently burned out and needed a break. The doctor had no reason to doubt him, so he invited Frank to observe him at the hospital. Frank accepted and regularly visited the hospital. During his time there, he studied medical books in the hospital library. He listened more than he spoke. He knew just enough to blend in. Eventually, one of the hospital's administrators offered him a temporary job to supervise medical interns on the night shift. It sounded safe, no real procedures, just watching over the team, so he accepted. Frank kept the act going by using humor to deflect questions he couldn't answer. The interns were the ones handling patient care, while Frank mostly stayed out of the way. But it all came to a stop the night a young patient came in with a broken leg. The situation was serious. Frank realized at the moment that someone could get hurt if he kept pretending, so he quit. After walking away from the hospital, Frank could have stopped there. He had already faked being a pilot and almost endangered a child as a doctor. But instead of learning from it, he just changed professions again, a clear sign of his immaturity, the last trait I mentioned. And yes, he was still a teenager, but immaturity isn't just about the age. Immaturity means doing whatever feels good in the moment without thinking about the cost or consequences. Lying gave him control. That's why his next move was just as bold. While in Louisiana, Frank reconnected with a flight attendant he had met during his pilot days, this time dating her in Baton Rouge. He told her he also had a law degree from Harvard and he was just taking a break from flying. She believed him and introduced him to her father, who turned out to be the state's district attorney. The district attorney said if Frank could show his Harvard transcript and pass the Louisiana bar exam, he'd help him get a job. So Frank forged the documents, studied for a few weeks, and actually passed the bar. He was hired as a legal assistant in the Attorney General's office shortly after that. But there was one problem. A real Harvard graduate also worked there, and he kept trying to befriend Frank, asking questions and talking about shared professors. Frank couldn't keep up the act and didn't want the risk of being exposed, so he left. After leaving the Attorney General's office, Frank pulled off one more major lie. He posed as a sociology professor at a small college in Utah. He faked a resume, claimed impressive credentials, and actually taught classes for a full semester. Students liked him. No one suspected a thing. But just like all the other jobs, it couldn't last. Eventually, the law caught up. By the time Frank was just 21 years old, he had faked 4 careers, crossed continents, and stolen over $2 million through check fraud. He had conned banks, hospitals, airlines, and even universities, all before he was old enough to rent a car. The FBI finally caught him in a small village in France. He was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually sent back to the United States. Frank was now facing serious time behind bars. But this isn't just a story about crime, it's also a story about change. After serving 5 years, something unexpected happened. The FBI made Frank an offer. Help us catch people like you and we'll let you out early. And he agreed. At first, it was just a job, but over time, Frank didn't just help the FBI, he rebuilt his whole life. He became one of the world's leading experts on fraud prevention. He started his own security company. He worked with banks, businesses, and even governments, teaching them how to protect themselves from scams and fraudsters. He also found something he never really had before: stability. He met his wife while working on an undercover FBI case. They got married and had 3 sons. He left the lies behind and built a new life based on honesty, something he had never really had the chance to do as a kid. He co-wrote a book about his life called Catch Me If You Can. That book later became a major Hollywood movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. It brought Frank's wild journey to millions of people around the world. Now, let's get back to the question we started with. Why did Frank Abagnale do all of this? Some people say he was a sociopath, cold, manipulative, dangerous, but that doesn't match what we've seen. Frank never set out to hurt anyone. In fact, when he realized his fake role as a doctor might actually put lives at risk, he walked away. That still doesn't excuse what he did, but it does tell us something about who he really was. In our opinion, Frank Abagnale was a scared, brilliant, impulsive kid, someone who didn't trust the world around him, who ran from his pain instead of facing it, and who used his intelligence as both a weapon and a shield. He didn't respect the rules because he thought they could be beaten, and for a long time he was right. But eventually life caught up, and instead of running again, this time he changed, and that sums up what kind of person he is. As for how he sees himself, Frank once said,
"Some say, you were brilliant, you were an absolute genius. I was neither. I was just a child. Had it been brilliant, had it been a genius, I don't know that I would have found it necessary to break the law in order to just simply survive. And while I know that people are fascinated by what I did some 50 years ago as a teenage boy, I've always looked upon what I did as something that was immoral, illegal, unethical, and a burden I live with literally every single day of my life, and will until my death. There are many who write and say, well, you were certainly gifted."
And maybe that's the most honest way to put it. He was a genius at doing the wrong thing until he chose to do the right thing instead.